Well, today we're with Cam Woolford. He's the director of Servant Leaders International, which is one of our ministry partners, actually is the ministry partner we work with throughout all of Latin America, but also here in the States. We connected, man, I can't even remember what year that was. I was trying to think the other day, how long ago was it that Derek connected us in Grand Rapids?
2014? Is that
Oh,
2014 probably?
are we running a decade now?
I think we're close to it.
Wow. Wow. So Derek Jewell, who is First Baptist Church in St. Louis, Michigan, connected with us through the Wilderness Institute over the years. He was on the board, I believe, of Servant Leaders at that point. And in the initial conversation was, hey, you guys do something similar, or at least use the same language in two different spaces. Would you sit down and have a conversation? And I remember sitting in, I think it wasn't an Applebee's, maybe it was a Chili's in Grand Rapids, Michigan, around the Church Ministries Conference, which we were out there for, and having a conversation with you and Dave Grafe. And at the end of that conversation came to the conclusion that Derek was actually right. There's a lot of shared DNA, and somehow that happened in two different ways, in two different places, two very different places over time. And then the Lord brought us together then, I guess, a decade ago. So I know you. Some of the people who are listening to this are going to know, oh, I know Cam Woolford. But for those that don't, talk a little bit about who you are and maybe some of your background and how did you get there?
All right. So, oh boy. So we have another connection, which would have been Baptist Bible College, right? So that's a lot of crossing over relationships there. My undergraduate was there, met my wife there, and then from there we moved to Michigan and helped church plant a church, mainly Mexican immigrants. At the same time, prepared to go to Latin America. We joined a mission board at that point and began fundraising and the whole process, and arrived in started the process in the mid '90s. Towards the late '90s, '97, we arrived in South America and began church planting. Church planted in South America for 10 years approximately, and then due to some family situations with the birth of twins and premature and all that other things that came with that, we couldn't go back to high altitude ministry. We were up in the Andes. We had to go somewhere a little bit lower. So we landed in the Central Valley of Costa Rica on the bottom side of that, in the city of Paraíso. Paradise, they called it. It wasn't paradise. Definitely not paradise, but that's the name anyways. And we were able to church plant there. And in that time, came in contact with Dave Grafe, began to struggle with some of the things that we had previously done in church planting, and began to ask questions about why we continued to help start churches that wouldn't flourish. They would just survive. And the measure of a successful church plant at that point in the circles we were running in, did it survive after you left it, right? Get the pat on the back because it survived. And the struggle of raising up leadership, of sustainable leadership, reproducible leadership, all that stuff there were always these big question marks, but nobody had a real good answer to a lot of the tough questions except to create more institutions. And those institutions needed to be carried over to faraway places in order to sustain the local church's ability to survive and, air quotes, and thrive. And so when we arrived in Costa Rica, we had been involved enough in church planting that we were struggling with that model, but didn't know how to get out of it. And so I could verbally cast a vision and think through the future. I'm wired that way. I can see things at 30,000 feet very clearly, but I couldn't put the map together to how to get to the place I knew we should be. And that's where Dave came in, and he, in our partnership together in church planting, was able to take vision and put strategy to it. And out of that strategy, a renewed focus on the centrality of the local church and a desire to see the church return to being the most powerful organism on the planet that God created it to be, to fulfill his mission, begin to come together. And some of the pieces of helping the church to become competent and confident in what it's called to do, and not just survive, but thrive. And how do we arrive at that point? So we started off at that point with the idea of local church-based training, which not a new idea, but the idea of getting back to where we've deviated from for the last 100 years, where the church was the center of all life and ministry. The training was there. We've deviated that. We contracted it out over the years to a bunch of institutions and trusted more in the institutions than the local church. And where you're forced, like places like the mission field, to not trust in institutions because they don't exist, then you have to get a regained confidence in how to make the church what the church is supposed to be. So that's been the trajectory of our lives, I would say, since 2000 and probably 11 and 12, in that process of developing that idea.
Which is interesting, because I always find interesting when you, from a ministry perspective, intersect with somebody else at the right time of what God's doing in two different stories. And then he brings those stories together and creates something that neither of you would have necessarily walked out the door, that morning and saying, oh, okay, I know where God's
Right.
taking this. And I want to get into that some here and talk a little bit more about servant leaders, its inception, and then also the training model a little bit down the road. But backing up a little bit, when in your journey did you discover missions was going to be the platform that God would take you to?
So I came to Christ as a late teen. My parents came to Christ in their late 30s, almost into their early 40s. I was raised Roman Catholic up in New England. So my trajectory changed when my dad felt the call to ministry and did a really hard shift towards ministry, and then moved us to Baptist Bible College in Clark Summit, Pennsylvania. My dad enrolled in the seminary to get his master's. I was drug along, kicking and screaming. And through that process, there were some interesting things that happened through that process in Clark Summit. But at the age of 17, I was born again and began to sense something different. And because we were connected to the college, I expressed that to my dad, that I felt like I really wanted to investigate ministry cross culturally. I'd seen some things, been exposed to some movies on missions, some videos, and so I said I want to do that. And he connected me with a ministry team out of the college that needed some hands, and so I joined a team of college students. I was still in high school, that went to Argentina and Peru for the summer. And I tagged along, and that whole experience just transformed, upended my world, and God confirmed in that time you needed to chase this path.
So was there a specific experience in that time, or was there something or was it something that as you processed the whole experience that just kind of sunk in?
Going into that, there was a sense of, okay, there's something he wants from me. I had a pretty strong sense of that. I didn't know what it was. And then going into that situation, which I grew up in the Northeast, it's pretty monoculture. So going into the situation where I'm now in Latin American culture, I'm surrounded by different language, different cultures. In Argentina, so for example, is so different from Peru. And we went to Peru, we went to Iquitos, Peru, which is in the middle of the jungle with a bunch of indigenous populations. So very different. All of a sudden, this desire to understand that was awakened in me. A love for something I didn't know I could have was awakened in me. And so I think through desires, through interests, he began to speak to my soul and lead me down that path.
So then, so you come back from Argentina and
Both, yeah.
Peru, both,
Hmm.
and end up enrolled at what's then Baptist Bible College, now Clark Summit University. Did you go right into a missions program at that point?
I did. I went right into the missions program.
Okay, and then you finished the ministry. I think you did. Did you do the Ariba program while you're as
I
part
did
of
a
your school?
year Riva program. It had just moved from Peru to Ecuador. We were the second group to go down when it had moved, and so it was in Cuenca. And so I was a part of that group. I came back from that experience a little bit shaken. Philosophically, there were some things that I participated in, and theologically, I was struggling a little bit with things, but still felt this overwhelming call. But I said, I'm not going back there,
Hmm.
because for me to go back there meant I'd have to go back into that environment where the philosophy and the theology were causing a lot of tension. And God's plan, coming back, finishing up. God directed us with some curves and corners back to Cuenca.
Hmm. So really, all of your downrange experience before graduating college, because Ariba was junior, senior year, somewhere in there.
It was my junior year. Yeah, it was a year-long internship in Ecuador, and I spent part of it in Peru again.
Okay. And so all of your downrange was in Latin America, and that wasn't necessarily by your own intention. It was just the opportunity that was in front of you. Did you draw that conclusion before the end of college that when you went to the field, it would be in Latin America?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like God's providential moving. You know, I do believe pragmatically, maybe I struggled with being somewhat of a deist for many years. That is God really specifically guiding and directing me that targeted. But over the years, I've been like, no, I'm definitely a theist. He's up close and personal, and he's actually determining my steps, right? And so, yeah, in those periods of time, he was kept pointing us back to Latin America. There were options and opportunities to distract us, different places that asked us to come and be involved or look at things, and we just kept being moved back to Latin America.
Hmm. And so graduated college, then language school. Was that the next step?
Graduate college, we did church planting and bivocational ministry in Southwest Michigan. Of course, there's the fun part of support raising, partner building. And so we did that for 2 years. And then we went to language school at Rio Grande Bible Institute on the border of Mexico, did a stint of ministry in Reynosa in Mexico during the time of language school, and then moved to Ecuador.
Awesome. So at that point, you had been Argentina, Peru, Mexico, and then Ecuador. So you had a pretty good cross section, which, having been a couple of different places with you in Latin America and experiencing those things, I think when you haven't stepped out into a place and a culture, you may draw the conclusion that there's a lot more similarities than there actually are, other than language and whatnot. So when you went into Ecuador then as a new church planting missionary, what surprised you? And then what was challenging and what was easy?
Well, I went back. My wife had never been there before, so she just took my word on everything. And so when she landed in Cuenca, that was her first time. And so I think what surprised me was the dynamic. Now we took 2 children at that time. We had 2 daughters. One was 3 and one was 3 months, I believe. And so now we're this young family arriving. And I think one of the surprises was the dynamic of doing ministry as a family in a foreign country. That was totally new, and how to navigate that. The other surprise was and this was a challenge too, as a new missionary, a part of that organization, they made it clear that your first year you do not have a voice or a vote. And so when you arrive, you submit. And so, and that's probably one of my most difficult character traits, has been over time submitting. And so God putting me in that position, because of my leadership tendencies as a directional leader, I had to submit to other people who were quasi-directional or maybe not directional, and I thought I could make better decisions. And so immediately they sent me to the coast, or on the road to the coast, which created a huge obstacle. So I'm flying solo, and I never wanted to do ministry by myself. But at this point, they sent me immediately to help plant a church 2.5 hours down the mountain from the city. That was my first objective that they gave to me.
Wow. So, so from a challenge perspective, you're running solo in a new place with a wife and 2 young children who are adjusting to something that is very different in every dynamic, language, place, culture, etc. Trying to build relationships. Where did you see traction early, and I guess how did that inform your experience there in that first church plant, inform some of the next steps?
So I didn't realize I had not been involved in leading a church plant. The church plant that we were involved with, up in Southwest Michigan, I worked with a gentleman from Puerto Rico who was a bivocational church planter. So I really followed him and observed him and had conversations with him, but I wasn't the driving force. Now that I was there after my first stint, now I was driving, I was leading the way mainly by myself. I began to realize that, boy, I have entrepreneurial tendencies. Like I'm a pusher, I'm a mover, really good for initial church plant stage, right? And I have a strong relational side, so I wasn't afraid of putting myself in positions with culture and people's homes that could be terribly uncomfortable. I just threw myself out there. So in the beginning, it wasn't even though there was culture shock and difficulty, and I was managing my family on the mission side of things, going out and being involved with the people on the ground, it was super easy for me. Super easy to get into homes, super easy to make new contacts. That was never a struggle. The struggle was on the other side with the other missionaries, because then you have other people with other ideas and plans, and there's a clash there that creates tension. And so this was revealing to me that, working with other people on the mission field that are also from your same country and your same organization is difficult. Releasing your gifts and abilities to a people that are not from your culture and your context was easy. And so that created a tension.
Interesting. And I'm not sure that that dynamic is something that is highlighted in any way for the person that's headed towards missions.
Mm-hmm.
That's new to the process. They're connected to the mission and the target, but that process of team dynamic, team building, and
Right.
in the field, it's not like you can switch bosses or switch partners or switch team
No.
members. I mean, who's there is who's there. That's interesting. So, in thinking forward, then to what I know about servant leaders and how you've built out that process, there's some things that make a lot more sense to me having downloaded
Right.
that dynamic. I would love to actually just go step by step and blow by blow because I think there's a lot to dig out. But in the interest of time, so you're in Cuenca then for how long?
Let's see. For the first stint, we were there 8 years.
Okay. And by the time you finished in Cuenca, what did the work look like when you transitioned out?
What did it look like? So we had been involved in 3 church plants on the ground there. And some interesting context. Okay, so we led in the one primarily. We were the one that took over and led. The other one they sent us in. I helped move the dirt, and then initially walked away, and then came back later on, and they sent me down to close it because it didn't have leadership. And so that was my first kind of experience to, if we can't find a leader to bring in from the outside, we have to close the church down. And so they sent me down there to preach the last message, which was super uncomfortable. Preach the last message, and then I said after the sermon, "Hey, just so everybody understands, this is the last Sunday. The door will be locked. There are no leaders. There's no leadership here, so we're closing this work down." And so that really exposed in me one of the great flaws in our system. And then the third church plant that we had been involved in was a church that I had been a part of as a student, that was continuing to be established over many years because it never had a good leadership system. So even after 10 years, 12 years of existence, it was continuing to struggle because there wasn't strong leadership raised up from within. So when we left the guy as best we could in charge of that third work. The one church was closed down, and then the other church that I led in was moving forward and thriving.
Wow. So 3 really different stories,
Totally different.
with some consistency and some inconsistency across them.
Right.
So when you transition then to Costa Rica, health situation, dynamics
Mm-hmm.
needed to be in a different elevation. Was it an existing work or was it a brand new work that you stepped into there?
So when I initially arrived in Costa Rica, and getting back to the theology of God's providence, all the things that led us there, I was fighting. So when we arrived there, my target was to use this as a springboard to get back to Ecuador. So my focus with the twins, our last two were twins. They were 26 weeks. They were terribly premature. So they had 85% of their lungs were damaged. My son had lymphedema at the moment. So we were battling a lot of health stuff. But in my mind, it was about, I need to get back to Ecuador. So when we landed in Costa Rica, in my mind, it was about a year. So I was going to give it a year to get us back to Ecuador. And so I was trying to find somebody that already had something going that I could align myself with and just inject some initial help and then tag out. And so when we arrived there, God in his providence brought us to a town. There was a guy there. It was actually an American that was married to a Costa Rican gal that loved fishing. He had a fishing boat. And so one guy said, hey, we should go meet this guy. I know you love to fish. Let's go talk to him. I went and talked to him. And out of that conversation, he said, hey, I got involved in a Bible study here in town. And it's terrible. The guy doesn't really know what he's doing. He could really use your help. So he gave me his contact information. I reached out, built a quick friendship, and I began to partner with him.
Interesting. So that was at that point, then there wasn't a church established necessarily. It was a Bible study that you stepped into and said, okay, how do I be helpful?
Yeah, they were meeting in his basement. There was, very little formality to it, but there was a small group, maybe 6, 8 people. And so at that point in time, I said, hey, I'll give you a hand. I think we can get this thing up to 20 people. And in my mind, the shift from informal church to formal church is around that marker. And so if we can move them to that marker, then we can begin to organize and launch as a formal church. And then I can push you out front and step away.
Which in a year time frame, hey, let's wash, rinse, go. Best laid plans. So,
right.
So then how long, remind me how long you were in Costa Rica, and then what did the work look like over the course of that time?
4 years. The work moved from that group, it just kept, we jumped 3 places, locations due to, we needed it to grow. So we went from a basement to a restaurant bar, to a doctor's office, to a storefront. That was like 4 moves. And so during that period of time, as those moves, so did the refining of my philosophy of ministry. And again, having a partner, which I'd never had a team member at that level, was like blow your mind. Oh, this can be better. Two of us together aren't dumber. We're smarter. We can actually get some synergy going here. And in that really facilitated, put grease on it to move the philosophical shifts that aligned with better theological understanding. And so then we moved to this idea of centrality of local church, multiplicity of leadership on all levels, like top down, right? So if we're going to talk about doing ministry and team, it has to be modeled at the top and then filter its way down, not the leadership saying work in teams, but we don't play that way.
So you get done in Costa Rica. What was the next step for you, and why did that transition happen?
So away from Costa Rica. So in Costa Rica, our team members at that point were deciding to move away. He was driven by a desire to do education. That's why he arrived in Costa Rica. I had not any desire to become involved in education, like training of leaders. I was church plant. I wanted to be involved in church planting. I didn't want to be involved in training up guys and get stuck in what I saw at that point as the muck. And so when he decided that they were checking out, we had already put a plan into place to transition the church to national leadership. And so our family decided, no, I think the next stage has come. We need to, reevaluate where we go from here. So we had created a 2-year follow-up plan with the church, turn the church over to the team of elders. And then for 2 years, we would come back. One of us would come back every 2.5 to 3 months to conduct training. And so for the next 2 years, that was the plan. We took a furlough, came back, took a little bit like a year-long furlough to try to figure out what the next stages was as we continue to travel back to Costa Rica. During that time, I got a phone call from the one church plant in Cuenca, Ecuador, who had been tracking with what we were doing in Costa Rica and asked if we would come and help him do the same thing at their local church. He was the lead pastor there, the only pastor. And so we prayed about it, decided it was a very difficult thing. I had 2 girls in high school already. One was going to be a senior, one was going to be a junior. So that move would be like, I've already moved and broken all the rules there, moving my kids too many times. And so this was going to be a big deal. As a family, we prayed about it, decided to do it. So we moved back to Ecuador for a 2-year commitment to help the church understand what it meant to have, number one, multiplicity, team ministry, and then how to create the systems internally to train. And my only experience up to that point was Roca Viva in Costa Rica, and it was very small scale. So this would be at a larger scale. We arrived in Cuenca, Ecuador, and he hands me a sheet with 30 families on it that I had no clue. I mean, I knew some of them from the past, but the majority were all new to me. And he said, here's your candidates. And so at that point in time, we had to step back and go, oh, man, well, this is not like flying by the seat of our pants, winging it. We need to formally understand what we're doing here, or we're in big trouble. And that birthed the formality of servant leaders.
Interesting. Yeah, and it's I always find it interesting when something gets birthed out of a question instead of a statement. Like, instead of here's what I think we should do, there's the question of, man, how do we steward this thing that God is
Right.
doing?
Right.
And it changes that nexus point of how you develop when you start from a question instead of a statement. And there's some humility involved in that process. And, the theme, as you're kind of talking about your experience in early in Cuenca, team dynamics, transition to Costa Rica, and the difference in the team dynamic as you and Dave started collaborating, and then, even this step, whether it's coming up out or being forced down in, there's a humility that has to happen to navigate all of those stages and say, okay, how do I take what the Lord's put in me, and not assume that it's an end point, but it's still kind of a beginning for the next point, and discover along the way and steward that. And leading from that place of discovery is not a common discipline. And for some of us, it is something the Lord, again, kind of drives into us like a nail, and others he draws up like a well. So I won't tell you which one I am.
Yeah, well, I can tell you which one I am. Yeah, it's painful.
Yeah. So we connected then a decade ago, really in the time after your 2 years back in Cuenca, when you're back in Michigan. Were you on furlough at that point, or had you transitioned home? And
so we transitioned. We were back in Ecuador for the 2 years, and during that process, again, we have 5 kids. We had launched one back to the States that was in college. We were getting ready to launch a second one who was a senior, and I had a daughter in sixth grade, and then the twins were in elementary school. The 3 youngest were in Ecuadorian school at that time, and supplemented homeschooling. And at that period of time, our number 3 daughter, we realized there was something not catching academically. And so we got her tested, and they said she needs educational therapies and some other stuff very quickly, or you're going to lose her. So when we finished up the period of time with the training in the church, turned the church over to a new team of elders, we made the transition back to Michigan without really understanding what this was all going to look like. Still under a mission organization, who was going to give me the liberty to travel around Latin America, and especially with the churches that we already had contact with, and help develop the idea of local church-based training. They had already had traditional institutions located throughout Latin America, but they didn't have a lot of organized efforts going on with helping local churches gain the competency and the confidence to do that. So they said, the network that you already have, you can navigate that in Central America and South America. So I did that for a time period to enable my daughter to get the therapies, not understanding what was about to take place.